Today we're going to talk about probably the most important role of government, which is to provide, decide on public or social goods. These are goods that have to be provided to everyone or to no one, and that everyone has information that's important to the provision of. These have really opposite problems to the problems of private goods, and we'll be developing this in this class and as well as in the next class. So I'm going to start with the definition of a public good. I'll both give a traditional definition that you probably know, as well as more informational definitions. I'll then talk about eminent domain and public bads. I'll talk about why decentralization is a destructive way to provide public goods, and then I'll talk about some of the private solutions to public goods and why they don't work so well. I'll talk about unanimity as a potential solution and why it doesn't work, about why it's necessary to use coercion as a result. Then I'll talk about ways of deciding on the provision of public goods, the flaws of voting as a way of doing so, and I'll use that as a way into the impossibility theorems for social choice. And then on Tuesday, I'll talk about quadratic voting as a potential solution to some of these problems. Okay. So, Lancelot, what's the classic definition of a public good?
It's like non-excludable and non-rival.
What do those mean?
Non-rival, that means that you might consume the good. That doesn't make it less, I guess, desirable for someone else.
Yep.
Like decrease the quality of it
Yep.
for someone else. And non-excludable means that I cannot exclude someone else from consuming it. Like
Yeah, exactly. And I think the non-rivalry is probably the most important part. Non-excludability says that everyone receives a benefit regardless of what we do. Examples that fail the first condition are usually called congestible public goods, while examples failing the second one are called excludable public goods. So IP, things that are protected by IP are like a classic example of a potentially excludable public good, but ones where it's really hard to actually exclude people from IP because it's too easy to copy the thing. Those are real public goods. Okay, so but let's consider an example of IP that's non-excludable, like a piece of music, and it's just too technologically hard to keep people from copying it. Would we really consider this a public good? Well, according to the traditional definitions, yes. But when we talked about IP, sort of the implicit thing we were thinking is that the innovator has the information about how valuable this product is, right? Whereas when we model public goods, we're going to think that that information is not held by one individual mostly, it's held diffusely by the whole population. And that, in some sense, is really, I think, and this is not what people usually say, but I think that's really, in some ways, the most important part of the definition of a public good, is that the information about whether the thing is valuable or not is dispersed among the public. And in fact, non-rivalry and non-excludability are really just reasons why everybody might have some stake in the thing and therefore have some information about it. So I actually think the most important definition of a public good is not these traditional ones, but that it's important that there's important information that is held diffusely by the public about whether this thing is valuable or not. And I think an innovation example helps show the distinction. So there's some innovations where, Bill Gates sees that it's going to be valuable to everybody, and nobody else can really understand or appreciate the good anyway. He has the vision, and as we talked about in the IP lecture, I think that that's quite important in some cases. But if you have something that's more like Kickstarter, you guys know what Kickstarter is? It's like where you start a company, but really whether it succeeds or fails is not based mostly or only on your vision, but on whether a bunch of diffuse people think that they would actually like to own that product, right? And that's a case where really you are trying to harness the information that exists from a really diffuse set of people about whether it's valuable or not, right? And now the truth is, most products are somewhere in between these two. They have some aspect of a public good, because the information about whether they're valuable is held by a lot of different people. And they have some aspect of like there's a visionary person who's pushing it. So in reality, I think there's a lot more public goods than we usually give credit for, at least to some extent. And on the other hand, some things that are public goods, but where like there's really like a visionary behind it who has most of the relevant information, that's not really a public good exactly. It's more like the IP scenario. Yeah, Oliver.
And so, and what you're saying here, the guy on Kickstarter, his entrepreneurship is a public good, even though the goods he sells might be private goods themselves.
Yeah, but I mean, most of what he's doing is creating an idea.
Yeah.
Once he's created the market, a lot of it's already done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, okay. So, returning to the standard criteria, is Yebin here? No. Could somebody else give an example of a pure public good? Some classic pure public goods? Yeah, Miles.
National defense.
Yeah, national defense is a classic, is probably the most famous example. Environmental services, like the weather, is a public good. The existence value of various things like the Grand Canyon, donations to charity that other people value because they don't want to see people poor. Things that everyone gets value out of from knowing they exist. Ideas are mostly public goods because it's hard to even know who benefits from them. It's very hard to keep them from diffusing. What's a classic example of a congestible public good, Miles? Roads, yeah. So infrastructure, amenities like lakes, parks, those are very hard to keep people out of, but they do get crowded when enough people start going into them. Is Tyler here? No. Can someone give me an example of an excludable but non-rival public good? Yeah, Zafan.
I think the library here is excludable good. That's only open.
But it's kind of rival, no?
Yeah, but it provided if there are like enough seats.
Yeah, I mean it depends on what range you're in. Yeah, but you know, a classic example would be most things covered by IP, right? Most things covered by IP are like, you know, drugs, prescription drugs, are totally non-rival because like it's essentially zero marginal cost to produce them, but they're excludable because you can keep people from consuming them. Another example of this would be land reform. So like imagine that we break up an estate like that's currently owned by a big landowner and there's lots of people who have plots. Well, once we break it up, you know, a natural thing would be to give it to all the people who are currently the tenant farmers on it. But of course you could exclude one of them from that if you don't like that person or if they don't pay enough or something like that. Okay, now the reverse of a public good is what I call a public bad. These are things that bring diffuse harm rather than benefits. So a classic example of this is land takings. So imagine that the government or a developer needs to buy up a chunk of land to build a development. That's going to hurt all the people who are currently there because they're going to take the land away from them, right? And it is public because you don't just want one piece of land, you want the whole chunk of land, and so it's going to hurt everybody or nobody, right? Corporate acquisitions are another example because all the people are going to lose their shares in the company or none if someone's going to take control. Debt settlements are another way like this. So like everybody has to give up their claims on bankruptcy in order for the company to avoid it. Munzi, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question
Yeah.
about land taking.
Yeah.
So when you say that it's harmful, does it mean the government is just taking their land without paying anything?
Often, or not paying very much. They're usually paying like only like the market value of the land. But if the people only valued at the market value, they already would have sold their land, right? So the fact that they're holding on to the land means they probably value it more than the market value. Debt settlements are another example of this to avoid bankruptcy. When the FCC was trying to put together all the spectrum for the spectrum to reorganize the spectrum, it had to effectively take spectrum away from a bunch of people. So that is sort of like a public bad. Patent pool assembly, if you want to put together a bunch of patents so that you don't have to negotiate with each of the people separately, that's going to be like a public bad on all the current patent owners. And of course, you could compensate people. In many of these cases, we do compensate people. But the point is, like, sort of absent the compensation, it would impose a public bad. The same way that sometimes we tax people for public goods, which would be public goods before the taxation, and after the taxation, they polluting projects can impose a public bad on a bunch of people. And these are not really that different from externalities, except that we think that the victim's knowledge might be important. If the victim's knowledge is not important, for example, in the pollution it might not be important, then we really shouldn't think of it necessarily as a public bad. We think of it more as like the scientist is the concentrated authority. So again, the distinction in public goods is to some extent quite similar to the distinction that we were drawing between things where we have like an expert in informational terms and things where we have this diffuse information that we need to try to aggregate. Now collective, we're going to talk about collective action problems for public goods. The equivalent of those here are the holdout problem, which is that any person who's affected by the bad, if they have property rights that can protect you from doing that, can hold out to try to avoid the collective good, collective bad being imposed. And therefore they can demand a very large payment, larger than the actual harm to them. Okay, so let's consider the simplest public goods problems. Imagine that people can make a contribution, AI, to a charity, and the value that we all get depends on the sum of everyone's contributions. So then the value to each person is going to be VI of A minus AI, but the value to society is V of A. And as a result, the total value that people get out of more production of the good is way bigger than each individual's value, right? So, for example, if we have symmetry, everyone's going to set V prime over N equal to 1 rather than V prime equal to 1, and that will lead you to produce much less of the good, assuming it's concave, right? And in fact, this can get arbitrarily inefficient as the number of people gets large, because everyone is going to free ride on everybody else effectively. So this is called the collective action problem. In large populations with voluntary contributions, public goods become arbitrarily underprovided. Okay, so this problem is quite pervasive, and I'm going to argue that you need some form of coercion usually to solve these problems. But let's first consider potential private solutions. One is altruism. So people often do some forms of public-spirited things like giving to charity, voting, volunteering for the military. And while people make choices related to these, they're not classic self-interest. Culture may play a role in promoting these. It may be prestigious to contribute to public goods. It may help you look good to other people, potentially mates, for example, might admire people who contributed to public goods. It might just make you feel good about yourself. This is called warm glow. You might use it as a way to show people what type of a person you are so you can get a better job in the future. And I think there's no question that these things help, but they require sort of the slow development of culture, and especially in circumstances where that hasn't had an opportunity to develop in a way that's geared to the specific situation, people are going to be very unwilling to contribute. So for example, if you think about the holdout situation, there's not like a culture around you should be willing to sell your house for the greater public good, even though that'll like force you to give up the place where your grandma lived, right? We don't have a whole culture that's developed around that. And more generally, I think it's often hard, especially in cases where people don't know each other, where we have a large number of people, etc., to get everyone to internalize all of these things perfectly. It's sort of like, imagine that we lived in a village economy where there was no market and no money, and everyone was supposed to just make things for each other as forms of gifts. we think that maybe could work in a very small village, but it's going to be hard to sustain a large amount of trading based on that. And similarly, it's hard to really, in a large society, provide public goods using these voluntary altruistic mechanisms, both for informational reasons, because these don't necessarily align people's interests like correctly and give the right decisions, and because it's just hard to sustain that sort of cooperation among lots of different people. Effectively, these are almost like Coasian types of mechanisms, and probably don't work as efficiently in very large societies. Okay. Another type of thing that people have proposed as a private solution is that if public goods are local, then, and people can easily move across places, then people can move to places where the public goods are good and away from the places where the public goods are bad. This is called Teague Competition. And the idea is that local areas will compete to attract people. And this might be important, and I think it is important for many local public services like street cleaning, schools, police, fire, etc. But it crucially depends on mobility and cheap mobility. If you like being in the place where you grew up and you don't want to move, right, then this is a much weaker mechanism. And in some sense, if people can move costlessly, then the thing no longer really is a public good, right? Because it's just, you can move to the other place and places can exclude people from coming in, right? And so that makes it both potentially rival because there's only so many people that can live in a place, and easily excludable because you can charge people for coming in. So what this says is that there's some extent to which things which might appear to be public goods are less public goods because you can move around, but it doesn't really solve the fundamental problem because people are often unable to costlessly move, and there are certainly some goods that sort of inescapably affect lots of people. Okay, so one of the most famous solutions to the problems of public goods came from two Swedes, Erik Lindahl and Knut Wicksell, and they gave an example of a mechanism that's called the provision point mechanism, which was actually the basis of the company that eventually turned into Groupon, though it ended up being a much less important part of Groupon. And they said, imagine that we have some project that is just, we're either going to get created or not. And imagine each citizen gets a value VI from participating from having the project created, and it costs capital C to create the project, right? So one thing you could do is you could ask each citizen to pay their share of the cost of the project. What is their share? Well, it's their value divided by the total value. And if everyone contributes, the thing gets built. If anyone fails to contribute, the thing doesn't get built. Now, that everyone is going to be willing to do that if and only if it's efficient, because if capital V is greater than C, then that means that little v is greater than VI over V times C, right, for each individual. And so that mechanism should work, and it should succeed exactly when things are efficient, right? So this is called Lindahl pricing, or Lindahl equilibrium, or Wickelsian unanimity. And I think that there's a lot of reasons to doubt that this would actually work in practice. Can someone tell me what some of those reasons might be? Yes, Sang.
The VIs
Yep.
for each person is a personal information.
Uh-huh.
Social planner or firm doesn't have any idea about VIs, so they can't offer opinion even.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it also might not be very credible as a way of doing things, right? Because what if one person does say no? Hey, I don't want to contribute. Would you really not build the thing just because that one person didn't contribute and like screw it up for everybody else, right? More important, yeah, if you don't know people's values, if you have even a little bit of uncertainty, this is going to get very very dangerous. Because even if there's only a small uncertainty you have, even if you're like pretty sure this is it, but there might be a chance that you're misestimating, then you could get one person that you misestimated who was unwilling to do it genuinely, and then you have to screw it up for everybody else as a result, right? And in fact, we can study this formally. Yeah, go ahead, Albert.
Can it be affected by collusion, like the mechanism?
How?
Or this new point colluding?
What?
Or is it a point colluding, like the mechanism?
I don't think in that mechanism there is.
I was going to say, is there not like an incentive compatible way to elicit people's preferences for that? Or,
In that situation?
yeah,
There is.
there is.
We'll talk a lot about that sort of stuff. But, yeah. That's sort of what everything's going to be about. But, yeah.
So
Yeah,
how
Jeff.
did Groupon want to use that? Was that they had to get a certain number of people signed up before?
Well, I mean, you can sort of see how in Groupon this was the beginning of Groupon, right? But the original idea of Groupon was that they were going to try to like do this for public goods. But that didn't work very well because, as we'll see, this mechanism doesn't work. It works under some very, very specific assumptions. So it requires totally complete information. If you have totally complete information, this does work because everybody thinks that they're going to be the one who's just pivotal. But if you have any uncertainty, it's a total mess. So let's go through why that's the case. So suppose that there was a CDF, which is capturing Saying's uncertainty, that there was some distribution of the valuations, and imagine everyone just had 1/n shares. So on average, they all are symmetric, right? So then the probability that any individual rejects is going to be capital F, the chance that their valuation is below the cost divided by n. So the probability that any individual agrees is 1 minus F of C/n. And the probability everyone agrees is going to be equal to this. Now imagine that we really know people's values well, and we can get this down to only 1 in 1,000 chance that anyone is going to reject, right? But once we have 1,000 people, there's only a 35% chance this succeeds. Even though, with probability 1 at that point, it's valuable for it to succeed. In a small town, the chances would be less than 1 in 20,000, right? And adjusting shares can't fix this, even if people are asymmetric. The best that you can do if they're symmetric is to divide it evenly. If they're asymmetric, you might want to divide it unevenly, but then still you are going to, with very, very, very low chance, be able to implement the thing. So, and this is not just true of this simple offer where we say, here's how much you have to pay, and you either do that or don't. Basically, any scheme is going to run into these problems. So, one thing you could do is you could say, okay, let's not just give everyone a simple offer, they either take it or leave it. Let's let people say how much they want to give. Well, but then we're back into the free rider problem. And so either we force people to give a certain amount, and then we run into this problem that there's this small chance that somebody doesn't like it, and therefore very high chance that there's at least one person who doesn't like it, or we're into this unanimity, or we're into the free rider problem. So this leads to a fundamental theorem, which I think is very powerful. It's called the Mela and Postlethwaite theorem. It says if everyone must consent to the funding of the project and no external funds are available, then the probability the project is undertaken without coercion goes to 0 as the number of people gets large. That says that there's no private, by private I mean voluntary and self-financing system that works. Yeah, Russell.
The external fund just means some seed money that happens to exist.
Yeah. Which is going to require some coercion to get anyways, in some sense, right? So.
And so
Yeah.
the assumption
Oliver.
here is that there's a central planner who knows the values with some noise.
Yeah.
And the individuals know their true values and will vote based on their true values.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So this says that public projects are always going to require some form of coercion. And this is true not just for this case, but for a general case. And coercion can operate in two ways here, right? We can either break that it's voluntary, or we can break that it's self-financing. And how does breaking each one of those involve some form of coercion? Luke?
So if it's not voluntary, then clearly it's coercive.
Yeah.
Because give me $10. If you don't, we'll throw it into a log. Then
Yeah.
That much stuff. If it's not self-financing, the financing has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you're not coercing people who are benefiting.
Yeah.
Presumably, then you must coerce someone who isn't benefiting.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so to take an example of how that works in practice, in public goods that are funded by taxing the beneficiaries of a service, like local communities raising property taxes or city governments for raising money to pay for services, or you can tax people outside, like getting subsidies from the federal government. But still, it has to come from someone's coercive authority. For public bads, you can either effectively just tax the people who live in the community and you can just take their land away, or you can buy their land, but then you have to tax the rest of the people in the city or someone outside the city to pay for that, right? And the Supreme Court has ruled that you have to pay people their fair market value for the land, but that's almost always, it really is always below what it's worth to them, because if they were willing to sell it for the fair market value, they already would have done it. And so usually these eminent domain projects, they use some amount of public funding, which comes from taxes, and they use some amount of effectively taxing the people whose land is being taken because they're not paying them the full value of that land to them. Okay. As a result, we need some method of determining when we're going to use this coercive power of the state, because consent is no longer giving us the determination of whether to use it, right? So when is it worth building a project? The situation is basically similar to the externalities discussion we had before. And what were the ways, can someone remind us of what were the ways we talked about trying to determine the value from a diffuse public back then, or from, Vidur?
Talking to people who like experts.
Yeah.
And then I think the other one, which we figured wasn't as useful,
Yep.
was surveys.
Yeah, and then we had a more incentive-compatible version of surveys, right? What was that?
That was the survey with the
Payments.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then again, we thought that didn't work either, right? So there's ineffective surveys or fancy mechanisms, and these are sort of used in declining frequency as we go down the list. So the only real differences here is that, especially with the binary case, it's a very simple decision rather than this continuous decision about how much externalities we have. And we think that the individuals, by sort of the way I've been defining the public good, we think that what individuals think about this, the information they have, is really, really crucial to making the decision. And there's usually a very large number of individuals involved. Now, in situations like this, we often use some form of voting to decide. Everyone gets some weight, and we approve the thing if it's above some threshold, right? Let's think about whether voting is a good way to make these decisions. Let's imagine that, again, everyone has even shares and IID valuations, right? Now, we want to pass the program when the sum of the values is above cost, or that is when the average value is above the average cost. But when is it going to pass under voting, Vidur? If we have, like, say, majority rules voting, when is this thing going to be implemented?
That'll be when, we want it to pass when each person's,
When the sum
of the shares is greater than the
Yeah.
cost. So it will pass when the portion of the share that for each person
based on their valuation is greater than the cost per, like their share of the cost.
Yeah, so you're close. It's when when a majority of people have a value that's above the per person cost, right? So that is, it's determined by the median valuation rather than the mean valuation, right? And therefore it's efficient only if it happens to be the case that the mean is equal to the median, which is true when there's a large number of people if the value distribution is symmetric. In a finite population, that's not even enough. Now, Ted Bergstrom made an interesting argument that this should affect the way we do taxation. And Jose, what was that argument of Bergstrom's? Does anyone else remember what Bergstrom argued? How could you design the tax system to make it more likely that you would have symmetric value distributions? Yeah, Connor.
Didn't you tax people proportional on their income?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that often people value things in proportion to their income, and their value per unit income might be more likely to be symmetric than their value overall, because the value overall is usually skewed, right? And so if you fund it based on not a even tax, but a tax that's proportional to income or proportional to other things that might be objective indicators of their valuation, then you might be more likely to restore symmetry and therefore to get majority rule to work better. Okay. And that's a more general principle, that you try to organize uncertainty in order to make the voting rules work better. So one other version of that is that, yeah.
I don't necessarily buy that the decision that maximize the willingness to pay is always the right decision. We sort of say this is what efficiency means. I mean, if you could organize lump sum transfers among people so that everyone is better off, that's what you would want to do all the time. But if you don't have the means to redistribute, to organize those lump sum transfers after the decision is implemented, I mean, I feel like you could argue that.
Well, we talked about this when we went through benefit cost analysis before as well, and I think that the basic principle is that different people tend to be on different sides of different issues, so on average this stuff cancels out. B, if you can identify people who are systematic losers from such a system, you can organize some overall compensating transfer that when you implement this system, you transfer to those people at the same time as you implement this system, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, yeah, Donnie.
Is there a problem that as n gets really big, people also know they have no effect on the outcome, so they may not be voting according to even their own self-interest?
Well, they won't. I mean, okay, sure, that could be a problem, as long as people have some other motivation. But if they're voting based on, as long as they're voting at all, and they're doing the rational thing conditional on voting, then it's fine. You'll still get the right thing. But if they've got some other thing that's motivating them to vote that's also distorting what they do conditional on voting, then that could matter, potentially. But I think most people do conditional on voting, vote for whatever they prefer. That's my impression. Okay, so you can improve efficiency by changing the voting rules. For example, rather than having majority rule, you could have a supermajority rule. The good is created if at least X% of the population supports it. And this is efficient in large populations if the mean of the distribution corresponds to the Xth quantile of the distribution, right? So, Moonsu, can you think of some cases where we might have a sense for the right X? Or at least some general area that it might be in? We want to choose X so that the Xth quantile of the value distribution corresponds to its mean.
Assuming we know the distribution.
No, I'm thinking of real world cases where you might have some sense for this. What? Yeah, so I mean, maybe if we thought the valuations were proportional to income, that could be a reasonable way to base things on. Absolutely. I mean, I think another way of thinking of it is just generally, if the intensity is stronger on one side, then we should shift it in that direction. So for example, if we know that there's a minority that's going to care a lot about an issue and is likely to be against the issue, and the majority is going to care less, and we're not quite sure what sides they're on, then you should probably have a supermajority rule, a significant supermajority rule. So for example, in gay marriage bans, I think there should be a supermajority rule to put those in, because the fact is, like, the gay people aren't really getting enough representation because they're a small minority that cares a lot about the issue. So having, for that sort of thing, a supermajority rule would make sense. On the other hand, if the thing benefits a minority, then you should probably have a submajority rule for it, right? So like, for example, a bill that would legalize gay marriage, I think, should have a submajority rule, because the people who are in favor of it are the intense minority. Yeah, Luke.
To what extent is this a non-issue, though, given that people don't show up that much? People don't donate money to campaigns that much. I mean, we already have the case where minority groups have more power because they can concentrate and focus. It's really the big minorities that you have problems with.
But the problem is that might not actually respond all that well to the extent to which there are minorities that feel particularly intensely about something, rather than So for example, it wasn't that clear that gay people did care a lot more about that issue, but it ended up actually being responsive to a very rich, small number of Christian conservatives who cared a little bit more than the average gay person did. And so it didn't really pick up on where are there large, a minority, but a significant minority who feels stronger than the rest of the population. And so those types of things are really just not necessarily, at least, responsive to the right features of the distribution that one should care about.
But isn't that kind of imposing subjective judgment? Because apparently these Christian fundamentalists care a whole lot.
Well, so I sort of agree. I mean, the problem with this sort of an adjustment is it does impose subjective judgments. So that's one reason why I don't think mechanisms based on this work that well. I mean, how do we implement this in practice in the U.S.? Well, we have some filibuster rules where you can sort of stop things being passed by the majority if somebody claims to feel intensely about it. But and if somebody doesn't claim that, then it can pass with a majority. But that's pretty subjective and easily manipulable. Supreme Court can basically overrule things the majority does to push through gay rights or whatever if they subjectively think it's benefiting a minority, but is that really a good way to figure that out? I mean, it depends how much information you think those guys have and how honest brokers they are relative to the information that's held diffusely by the population. If you think the information is held diffusely by the population, you'd really like to have a mechanism that aggregates that better. Well, we'll go through why that might or might not, work. Okay, so Albert, can you explain why, voting isn't all that efficient? Why these things aren't really working that well at addressing the problems we were just talking about? What information is missing from a vote?
I mean, in voting, it's binary.
Yeah.
One, and it doesn't know how much someone really value or something.
Exactly. That's the key thing. So it gives ordinal, not cardinal information, and because we lose that cardinal information, it's very hard to make a right decision. Imagine that you went into the marketplace and all you could say for every good that showed up was, I like that or I don't like that. It would be really hard to figure out, unless everything had exactly the same price, for example, what goods you should be assigned, right? And voting can create further problems when the issues are manipulable by an authority. So a particular example of this is, imagine that we were going to do eminent domain, where to provide a check on the government not giving people enough money, the government could make whatever offer it wants to people, and then we held like a majority vote. Jack, what would you do if you were the government?
If I wanted it to pass,
If you wanted it to pass, and you wanted to pay the least that you could possibly pay?
I could find just above a majority of people who are willing to go through with it and pay them what it costs to have them agree, and then give nothing to everybody else.
Exactly, right? So you can, offer just enough to get 51% in favor and screw the other people, right? And this can easily lead to inefficient expropriation and, inefficient underinvestment, all sorts of problems, right? And that's just one example of the tyranny of the majority, which is a problem I think we've seen writ large in the news recently on many different issues. So, for example, majority shareholders in a company can easily buy up 51% and then loot the other 49%, right? We talked about that in an earlier class. Populist governments in Latin America propose things that will gain 51% support, but ruin the economy for the other 49%. We saw what happened in Egypt when you had a bare majority of Islamists put in a government. Didn't work out too well for other people and didn't work out too well for the future of that country. In Iraq, over and over, we see that bare majorities can easily do things that are probably not in the broader interest. Okay, so to fix this problem, most societies have quite a lot of checks on the rule of majority. So they have, as Luke was pointing out, some ability for people to lobby or log roll, or they have a Supreme Court that tries to represent the interests of the minorities. They have checks and balances, etc. But as we found out with recent things going on in Congress, these are perhaps not the most efficient solutions to these problems, and often even create more harm than they do, good, I think, at least arguably so. Now, the problems of voting are even more strongly manifest when you have many choices to make. And this was first observed by Condorcet in 1785. So imagine that there are more than two alternatives and you have to choose one of three. And imagine there are three voters. And imagine the first voter prefers choice A over choice B and over choice C. The second voter B, C, A. And the third voter C, A, B. So who should we consider the winner in this vote, Connor?
I don't think there is a winner.
Why not?
Because there's no candidate that strictly is preferred by three of them.
Well, but could you get a majority for any candidate?
I don't think so, no. Because, the average rank of all of them is 2.
But what if you ran an election of A against B? Who would win?
Well, then they would. I guess A would win then.
Right? But what if you run an A against C?
Then C would win.
Okay, so maybe C is the winner. But what if you ran C against B?
Then B would win.
Yeah, that seems pretty weird. Right? Yeah, so you can get 2 votes for A over B, B over C, and C over A, right? So it doesn't seem like we can come up with a good reason to favor one over the other. This is called Condorcet's paradox of voting. And you could say, well, maybe this is just a tie among the candidates, right? And perhaps there is some coherent system we can come up with. And many are proposed in practice. We'll talk about some of these. But plurality rules, runoff rules, many things like this are considered examples. But Arrow in 1950 showed that there was a fundamental limitation on any such ordinal system. And he proposed some basic principles that any voting system should satisfy. Does anyone remember what those were? Yeah, Lancelot.
So it has to be Pareto efficient. So if everyone prefers A to B, he has to prefer to B.
Yep.
It has to be non-dictatorial. So there cannot be one individual who always gets his will.
Mm-hmm.
There's irrelevance of independent alternatives.
Yep.
So that means that if I rank A over B, and then all of a sudden I change the ranking of C.
Yep.
With respect to B or A, I should still prefer A over B. I mean, if the social ranking was
Yes.
A over B, and then you have to introduce another option, they should still
Yep.
prefer over B.
That's
and
right.
Unrestricted domain.
Yeah,
Which means that you have to be able to accept any preferences.
absolutely. Great. So Arrow says that under these conditions, there's no rule that satisfies all these conditions, or if you take the three conditions other than dictatorship, the only rule is dictatorship that satisfies these. So this provides a pretty strong sense in which democracy is flawed. Now, it may be that runoff systems are in some sense better, but in the end you'll have at least some problems. Now, some people responded by saying, well, independence of irrelevant alternatives seems too strong. Like, shouldn't it be the case that if we introduce C and I really rank it higher, then maybe I should get less weight in the decision of A versus B because I'm getting my say in C? And Gibbard and Satterthwaite raised a problem with anything that tried to do that. So what they said is that if you remove independence of irrelevant alternatives and you replace it with the idea that everyone has to have a dominant strategy to report their true ranking, then you get the same result. So dominant strategy can be substituted for independence of irrelevant alternatives. Okay. And Connor, can you give some intuition for why dominant strategy can replace independence of irrelevant alternatives?
I'm not really sure what you mean by dominant strategy.
Okay, sorry. That means that you have to always have an incentive to report your true ranking regardless of what everybody else is doing.
Oh, because then if the alternative isn't there anymore, then it'll all change.
Or what if everybody else puts the alternative way down and so it doesn't matter, right? So then, it would shift, right? So imagine that the choice between A and B is really the crucial one because everybody else is like evenly divided between A and B and C is way down, right? Then you're going to always manipulate your voting list to make A as important as possible if the presence of C could change the weight that you get on A versus B, right? So that's basically the problem. So Arrow's result is true if we replace the IAA with strategy proofness, and this is very pessimistic, but it relies on some very strong assumptions. So in particular, remember that we said before that if you had a strategy proof mechanism in a different context, it had to be VCG. Which, as we found out, VCG is like a terrible disaster of a mechanism, right? It's like subject to all sorts of collusion, budget balance issues as well. So here, we don't have intensity, and so rather than getting VCG, we get dictatorship. But still, there's something about strategy proofness which is really, really strong, right? However, democracy as a principle, in some sense, fundamentally relies on the notion of cardinality, right? That's sort of like of ordinality. That's sort of the fundamental principle of democracy, that you can't have more votes on something. All you can say is, what you want. And this, I think, should not be interpreted really as a fundamental limitation on social choice rules, but rather a fundamental limitation on just purely ordinal social choice rules and ones that have to have strategy proofness. So I'm letting you off really early. If you guys want, we can start the next lecture, or let me see how long it is. Yeah, it's pretty long. So why don't we get started a little bit on this? I'll just do a little bit. Okay, so that's all a lead up to say that today's class, the next class is going to be rather than like most of the lectures, which have sort of surveyed some broad issue. Today I'm actually going to cover. And that led us to some pretty pessimistic conclusions about this big problem of social choice. Today I want to try to give something more concrete, which is really just one paper, but is a practical solution to this problem. And it's based on research which is all currently in progress. And I hope this will give you a sense of what's most exciting to me about being an economist, being able to try to propose new institutions for solving these types of problems. So I'm going to go through some of the problems with existing mechanisms. I'll then propose the quadratic voting mechanism. I'll give a basic analysis and intuition for its benefits. I'll then talk about some of its robustness to some of the issues that we raised with the other mechanisms. I'll then talk a little bit about extensions of the basic idea, applications of it to a wide range of problems, and then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about the role of an economist in society. Okay, so in the last in the last lecture, in the one that we just finished, we saw that one of the fundamental problems with democracy was the lack of cardinality. So a natural approach to introduce cardinality is to use some of the externality mechanisms we talked about before. But these all have some fundamental flaws. And I realize I don't have the little sheet, so I'll just leave it here. This is a taste of what we're going to do next time. And on Tuesday, we'll try to get through all of this. But hopefully, if I go a little bit over, you won't hold it too much against me because I'm letting you out really early today. So.